An updated plan is now in place in the event of a major fire in the port of Corpus Christi. The Coast Guard teaming up with law enforcement and other first responders to demonstrate just how they would handle that kind of emergency.
Madeline Dart joins us now with more on today's training exercise. Maddie.
Joe McKenzie, the training was essentially about them all being on the same page. Now the agencies, along with port officials, going through tabletop exercises so everyone knows how to react in case of an emergency.
It's critically important that we have not just the Coast Guard out here, but we have all of our port partners, including industry, as well as the state local officials. And we have that here today.
Officials were told they would discuss their agency's plan in case of an explosion and fire aboard a ship in the port. Department heads then sharing their agency's plan for such a situation. This way everyone knows each other's roles if the fire were to happen.
Similarly, Coast Guard could also go into a fire and help provide assistance in some way, shape, or form because we know how that structure is organized.
Throughout the day, the scenario continued to unfold and the agencies met to discuss how they would react. Captain Smith says communication and collaboration are key in the case of an emergency. There were also oil companies at the training to both share and listen to plans so they know how to react if a fire were to break out on one of their barges. Joe McKenzie.
All right, thank you, Maddie.